always begin my presentation in this way because it's interesting how God works in our lives. I always wanted to be a physician. That was the plan all along, was to go to medical school to follow my father, who's a cardiothoracic surgeon. Medicine runs in my family. My mom's a nurse. We grew up at the dinner table talking about what surgery Dad did that day. I know it doesn't sound great dinner conversation for many people, but it was just a part of it. I grew up in that world, loved it, was fascinated by the human body, what could be done to the human body. Some of that has spanned on. I have a sister who's a nurse practitioner. I have another sister who's a NICU nurse. So medicine is still very much a part of our family conversation. However, when God called me to be a priest, I actually thought I was leaving medicine behind. I thought, well, that was my idea. I'm moving on. Interestingly enough, how God works, as I was doing my research on my first master's, I became interested in the issue of cryopreserved human embryos, which I kind of talked about in the last presentation. Wrote my first master's thesis on that. Got me a little bit of recognition, and I was told, see, you did something really well, which means we're going to give you more work. So go off and study bioethics. As I went off and focused in bioethics, I then focused my area much more on end of life, because that's what we face today. Mostly, a lot of that research was in the area of the patient-clinician relationship. What happens when a patient wants something and a physician doesn't believe it's moral? What happens when a physician believes something is moral and a patient doesn't want it? Which comes up all the time in modern hospital ethics today. So there's my lovely family. They like to use me, so I use them. It's amazing. They never tell anyone a priest till they need, like, a priest bails you out. And then all of a sudden, oh, I forgot to tell you, my brother's a priest. Do I have to go to baptism class for my kid? No, my brother's a priest. So I'll use them for whatever good they're worth. As sad as it is to say, I'm a Catholic priest. In the world today, I have to tell you that. That's considered a conflict of interest in ethics. I adhere to the teachings of the church. Hard to believe. I've never found a conflict, though, between faith and reason. I also do have to declare one other conflict of interest, and that is because we will talk about hospice care today. I am actually a contracted provider for Mercy through DeGraff Hospice. That doesn't influence my view, but I am required to let you know up front that there could be a conflict of interest there. Where then are we going? I was asked to speak on end of life, and I'm thinking, oh boy, where do you start? What can we cover? And so I'm going to take a 50,000-foot view and see if we can stay there, and then we'll come down and land for each of your own individual questions. I want to just introduce it. I want to ask the question, what is my obligation to preserve my life? How do I determine when I no longer need medical procedures? If I need a particular drug, those kinds of things. Then I want to get into the issues surrounding death. What does it actually mean to be dead? What about organ transplant? All of those situations. And then I want to make sure that you are prepared for the end of life, because the number one problem I face is very few people have any kind of plan for the end of their life, and it turns ugly. I have seen families torn apart by this, and it could very easily be avoided with just a little preparation. So I encourage you in that area. Look, death is changing. 50 years ago, you just sort of passed away. We still use that language now, don't we? We say people have passed away. And I don't know about you, but I kind of like the stained glass image. That's how I want to go when it's my time, if I can, surrounded by my family on my deathbed. But the other image you see there out of an intensive care unit is becoming a reality today. People are dying connected to tubes and medications. They're dying, sometimes fighting it right up to the end. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Medicine is good. A lot of us wouldn't be here today without the advances of modern medicine. But as medicine advances, the way we die is changing. Very rarely do people just sort of seemingly pass away anymore. And so we have to step back and ask ourselves, what does it mean to die well? What is the art of dying well? What about all these things that are available to me? Just because we've come up with something new that we can do, doesn't mean we necessarily should do it. Or just because something might be good for one person, doesn't mean it's good for everybody in all circumstances. So my hope is to begin to sort of break some of that down and help your mind sort of begin to process where the church comes in to help on this. This is one of the beautiful things I love about medical ethics. If you've heard me speak before, it's the place where science and religion meet. And it's fascinating. They never contradict each other. As a matter of fact, we're seeing a lot of science now that is supporting all kinds of teachings our church has held for a very long time. I would love to write a book on that one day. I would love to write a book on ethics and the church's teaching, arguing only secularly and showing you how when you fall into sin, when you break the church's teaching, you actually harm yourself. I think we'd be surprised by what we saw. Because you see, the church's moral tradition is rooted in respect for the dignity and sanctity of every human person. It's rooted in our understanding of who you are as a person. And if we don't get that, we're done. If we think that a human person is just another object, just another thing, then our medicine begins to go down that route. We begin to use people as objects. We've done this in the history and in the not too distant history. And rightfully, we fought wars over this to prevent that from happening. You see, as a church, we recognize that we are created in God's image and likeness. But we're not just created in his image and likeness. We are redeemed by the price of his son's blood. And we share a common destiny of eternal life. That's the foundation for all of this. And if we keep that in the back of our minds, we're going to pick the right answer most of the time. We're not just another creation. We're not just a conglomeration of molecules. We are willed by God. What does that mean about my life? It means my life is not my own. I didn't do anything to bring myself into existence. And if I truly believe the cross and the resurrection, then somebody else ransomed me. Which means I'm not free to do whatever I want. And so as we begin, I want to make sure that we get that in clear. That we are all created in God's image and likeness. We are redeemed at the price of his blood. And we share a common destiny. One of the most powerful passages in the book of Romans. God proves his love for us. And that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God loves us. He proved that by suffering and dying on the cross. And I know I'm not telling you anything new, but if you stop to think about what this means for how we live our life, if God loves us, he wants what's best for us. As God, he knows what's best for us. Thus, sin not only offends our relationship with God, it harms us. Thomas Aquinas says God is only offended by us when we act against our own good. Doing what is good for me is perfectly in line with what our church is teaching. And I hope you see that, and I have a couple powerful stories to show you that as we get to the end here. It's not easy to say. None of us like to think about our death. But it's the one thing that's certain. All of us will die. For you philosophers out there, you could almost say that all of us are in the process of dying. From the moment we were born, weren't we in the process of dying? But I'll leave that for a philosophy lecture. But it's going to come. And it's the most important moment in our life. Look, let's just dumb down Catholic morality to its most basic thing. Do good and avoid evil and be settled forever in heaven. The psalmist reminds us. In other words, die baptized without having committed mortal sin or having unforgiven mortal sin, and eventually you will make it to heaven. You see why the moment of your death is now the most important moment in your life? It's the last moment for conversion. It's the last moment to turn back to God's love and say, I surrender to your will. It's also the last minute to decide to do it on our own. And so as we think about these things, it's important for us to keep that in mind and the seriousness of what we're undertaking. But it's also important for us to remember God's love is very merciful, and his mercy is endless. And I say this because this is something we're going to talk about today that everyone in this room has experienced. All of us have loved ones who have passed away, and I would venture to say everyone in this room has had difficult ethical questions at the end of life somewhere in their family. It's that common. And oftentimes when I give this presentation, sometimes people will say, well, I didn't quite do it that way. And there's a guilt that can settle in. I don't want that guilt there. Remember, in order for something to be a mortal sin, it has to be gravely wrong. We have to know what's wrong, and we have to freely choose to do it. So as long as we are acting in a place of charity, where we recognize that we are created in God's image and likeness, we are redeemed by the price of his son's blood, and we share a common destiny, and we want what is best for the other, perhaps we have more to learn. But I don't want you to hold past experiences against yourself as we go forward. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. let's talk about our obligation to preserve human life. Human life is good. We're creating God's image and likeness. We're not dualists who believe that our soul is trapped inside our body and we have to free ourselves. Go read the Cathars in southern France. They do crazy things because they have this belief. The body's good. It's sacred. It's a temple of the Holy Spirit. Thus, we have certain obligations to it. But this life is not all that there is. We know that there is another life to come. If this life is all that there was, then yes, I need to do everything in my power to keep myself alive, because the second I die, or perhaps the second you forget about me, it's over. But that's not true. Thus, we have to make sure that we're respecting, and it's a double edge. I can neglect things, but I can also do extreme things that may not be ethical. My latest master's thesis was on that. A case in one of our local hospitals where a nurse and the entire medical staff said, "We're done. We are torturing this patient. I can't do anymore." And the family was saying, "Well, you have to." So we have an obligation to use ordinary and proportionate means to preserve our life. The church uses two sets of terms, either ordinary and extraordinary, or proportionate and disproportionate. These are perhaps the most confused terms in medical ethics today, and I'll show you why. Proportionate means are those that in the judgment of the patient offer a reasonable hope of benefit and do not entail an excessive burden or an excessive expense on the family or the community. Two important things to notice. In the judgment of the patient. This bothers people when they hear that, because it's like, well, we want what's right. Why am I being subjective and allowing the patient to do it? Let me tell you a story I had a little while ago. I was asked to consult on a man who was dying. A man whose daughter, we didn't know it at the time, was engaged to be married. All the options for his cancer had run out. However, there was a very expensive drug he could have taken which could have prolonged his life. I think it was 9 months to a year. However, he would have probably remained in the hospital for those 9 months to a year. Or he would have died within 2 months if we would have just ceased treatment, but he could have gone home, he could have been comfortable, he could have been surrounded by his family and friends. Everyone on the medical team said, "Why are we even offering this drug? That's crazy." But the man was adamant about it. So I met this man. It's one of these conversations you never forget. It was like midnight, which actually is the best time to visit someone in the hospital because all the doctors are gone for the day and you can actually have a serious conversation. And I remember sitting there and we were talking about his life, and he finally just started crying. And he said, "My daughter gets married in 4 months. I want to be there to walk her down the aisle. This is important for my family that I be there, and I'm willing to suffer to make it happen." Oh. All of a sudden, that drug that seemed extraordinary now seems perfectly ordinary. And actually seems as though he was seeking the right thing. The man chose to have that drug until his daughter's wedding and then decided to go off it and pass peacefully. You can imagine the good that did for his family. You can't just look at it objectively in that sense. So it's very important. The other thing to recognize too is sometimes we want to tie this to the treatment itself. So people will say, "Well, Father, is this treatment ordinary or extraordinary? Is a heart-lung machine ordinary or extraordinary?" It's not in reference to the particular treatment, because that can change. What's ordinary in America may be extraordinary in Calcutta, India. What's ordinary in the city of St. Louis may be extraordinary in the extreme wilderness of North Dakota, in the outskirts, even within our own country. Therefore, proportionate care means there is some hope of benefit. It's a loose term. For example, the cancer patient, his benefit was the good of his family, being there for his daughter's wedding. Not necessarily a medical benefit. He was still going to pass away. Should be commonly used, not too difficult, reasonably simple, and proportionate to one's status. I believe that if one is in a state of mortal sin, there is no such thing as extraordinary care. Because the highest good in our life is attaining eternal life. And therefore, if one has not made peace with God, it would not be extraordinary. Good luck convincing a secular hospital of that. But I think it bears some thinking, especially in relation to some of our family members. Or, for example, more practically or more simply, something would not be extraordinary if we're still waiting for a priest to come to offer the last sacraments. Seems as though we should be doing a little bit more and perhaps backing off later. Something is disproportionate if there's a certain impossibility, there's some sort of great hardship that's required, excruciating pain, extraordinary cost, intense fear, or repugnance. This is where it gets very tricky, and this is where there's a lot of modern issues. I consulted on a case recently. It's a fascinating case. I won't get into all the details, but it shows you the cost factor. It was a man who was in this, it was an Israeli national who was in this country illegally. He had come in legally, his visa had expired, but he had been here for like 20-something years. However, because he was a Muslim Israeli, he didn't have the necessary paperwork to get back home. He was being treated in a poor clinic here in the city. Unfortunately, his condition deteriorated to a point where he now needed dialysis. Very expensive weekly expense. Something that with insurance, and you and I, and even if we don't have insurance, government subsidy basically covers. But he's not a candidate for that because he's here illegally. The usual plan for this is we just send you back home to your country of origin. I would simply suggest to a hospital that a plane ticket is not going to kill your bottom line. And the humane thing to do would be to invite the man back home where they could provide medical care. Now, Israel has great medical care, but he couldn't get back home to his country. Meanwhile, this healthcare system was saying, we can't afford to pay for this. What do you do? Oh, we got into a great fight over this one. Ultimately, I challenged their Catholic identity. But that's a topic for another time. But you see how, for you and I, we wouldn't even have the conversation about whether dialysis is extraordinary or not. It's covered for us as American citizens. However, for someone, the guy living right next to you, it may actually be extraordinary. That's where we get into the big debate of artificial nutrition and hydration. How many of you guys were here for dinner? Could I see your prescription, please? No, I'm serious. You just ate. And you're going to tell me it's a medical procedure? I like to eat, and I'm not going to see my doctor every time I want to eat. It's just nutrition. It's hydration. It's sustenance. We cannot say that that is a medical procedure. Thus, it wouldn't be up for ordinary proportionate means. Now, I will grant you, though, that there are times where the means of administering nutrition and hydration could be called into question. Tubes and ports and things like this. In my time as an ethicist, I have seen one case where it was extraordinary, and that was because of a particular form of intestinal cancer where they couldn't get a port in. Think about it. It's uncomfortable, yes, but a tube, not that expensive. As a matter of fact, some tubal feedings are actually cheaper than your regular grocery bill or a port. Perhaps a little bit of pain to put it in, but it keeps you alive. Nutrition and hydration then itself, food and water, are not medical care. And then we could evaluate the means of delivering the nutrition and the hydration and whether or not that is extraordinary care. But it's very basic care. It doesn't match any of the criteria. There's a good hope of benefit, right? You're going to remain nutritionized and hydrated. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to cure your illness, right? But think of the nutrition and hydration. What is the purpose of the food and water that you're about to eat? To keep you nutritioned and hydrated. Does it do that? Is there a hope of benefit? Yes, it will succeed in that mission. It's commonly used. It is not too difficult. It's reasonably simple. And I don't care who you are. We get upset when we see the poor children in Africa who are starving to death. Because we recognize every human person should have a right to have nutrition. So it doesn't matter what your status is. You deserve at least that. People like to make it a big deal because it's an easy way to get into the conversation about death with dignity. A friend of mine is a permanent deacon who is the medical director of Cancer Treatment Centers of America in Tulsa and has just come out with a groundbreaking study. Do you want to guess the average stay in hospice? 3 to 7 days. You want to guess about how long it takes you to die of nutrition and hydration? 3 to 7 days. Depends on, nutrition-wise depends on how heavy you are. Hydration is going to go pretty quick. That's a scary stat. Have you ever walked into a hospice place and seen anyone on an IV? Why? It's a question that needs to be explored a little bit further. The question, when this comes up, the common question I tell people to ask is, they should ask their physician, if I stop eating and drinking, what will I die of? It is true, in that active dying phase, towards the very end of your life, your body can no longer assimilate nutrition and hydration. In which case, then it would be acceptable to stop. The question I tell people to ask their medical provider is, when my loved one dies, if we are honest about their cause of death, what will be the cause of death? Will it be a lack of nutrition and hydration, or it will be the underlying cause of their death, whether that's cancer, whether that's whatever illness? It's a pretty simple way to begin to ask the right question of your medical provider to get the right way. I've got a scary story that I'll tell you about when we get to euthanasia, when we get to that section. Look at where we are. Euthanasia, no one's really a big fan of. Physician-assisted suicide, it's coming. It's legal in places in this country. It's been introduced in the Missouri legislature for the past 4 years, I believe. It's gone nowhere. It's never gotten out of committee, but for the past 4 years, it's been introduced in our state legislature, which should be enough for us to go, wait a second, we need to get out in front of this. They are technically different. Euthanasia means literally an easy death. Basically, a doctor ends a patient's life by a painless means. Here's the scary thing. It could be voluntary or involuntary. It could be the patient choosing that they want this to happen, or it could just be done to you. You might be involved in it, or you might not. Whether you want to believe it or not, this is happening in our hospitals today. A little while ago, a priest called me. He said, Father, I've got one of my parishioners in the hospital. Something's not adding up. Can you visit with him? Sure. It was a man in his 80s, severely obese, who had gone into the hospital for pneumonia. By the time I got there, I think it had been like 5 or 6 days, he'd been hospitalized. When I finally got access to his medical chart, I'm reading through, and I'm beginning to note that the physicians are saying his pneumonia is getting better. The treatment is working. However, he has an altered mental status to the point that he's just basically sleeping in a chair all day. And you can't even have a conversation with him. So I dig a little bit further, and I'm looking at the nutrition facts in his chart. The only thing he's been offered is what is called D5, which is basically a saline and sucrose solution, water and sugar. I don't know about you, but if I don't eat for a day, I start to lose focus. We're going 5, 6 days without food. Imagine what your mental status would be. So naturally, I became suspicious because that's my job. So I spoke with the attending physician. I said, can you explain to me why we're not giving him any nutrition and hydration? And the physician gave me the stock answer. Well, he failed his barium swallow test. For those of you who are not in the medical field, obviously, if you have pneumonia, we don't want more fluid going down into your lungs. So they give you this test to see if that's going to happen. That's a good thing. But what they'll say is, if you fail that, then we're not going to give you nutrition or hydration because we don't want fluid to go down. And I said, I get that. I said, but why haven't we started a tube or a port? Why haven't we started talking about artificial nutrition and hydration? To which I got no answer. So you know what I did? I played the game. I said, let's step out in the hallway for a second. I said, I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. But let me just tell you what I think is going on here. I think you have looked at an obese elderly patient, and you know that he's going to be back in the hospital sometime later this year. You also know that his quality of life going forward is probably not that good. He's so severely obese. You also know that he's on government health care. And that's number one, your hospital's not getting paid enough for this. But number two, it's costing taxpayer money. I said, I could be wrong, but I might think, or could you see how I might think that perhaps you found a way to euthanize him? I said, I don't know. I said, but I've been asked to give a consult from an ethics perspective to this family. I'm going to go get a cup of coffee, and when I come back, I'm going to give this family my professional understanding of what I think is going on. I came back about 15 minutes later to questions about what if about feeding tubes and artificial nutrition and hydration. I am proud to say that man is still alive today. I don't know. I can't predict their intentions. I don't claim to read their intentions. It's not my job to judge them. But something was going down a wrong path there, having to do with nutrition and hydration. And it's an easy way to do it. Physician-assisted suicide is where a doctor assists a patient to commit suicide. This is oftentimes done with a cocktail of drugs. It's legal in certain states in our country, and it's happening in Missouri even though it's illegal. I got a phone call recently for a pastoral visit to a patient who had just come home from hospice care. And I was busy that day, I was running all over the place, so I remember asking the secretary, is this something I need to get to right now? Like, is he actively dying? Or can I wait till later tonight or maybe tomorrow? To which the family said, no, you better come now. So I'm thinking I'm going to walk into a situation with a patient who's basically unconscious in that active dying phase. No, I walk into a nice man who's sitting upright in his chair, who just walked from the lunch table back to his bedroom, and we have a great 30-minute conversation. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is good. Someone actually called Father before the last second. I'll see him again in a couple days and we'll continue our pastoral care. I got a phone call the next morning at 10 a.m. Father, thank you so much for coming. I want to let you know that my dad passed away last night, about 3 a.m. Really? How did that happen? Well, he took his pills and went to sleep last night. Call me cynical. Something doesn't add up there. It's legal in a lot of states, and it's legal, it was first legalized in the Netherlands, and so that's the area we want to study, because it's been legal there for a long time, and you're beginning to see the problems with it. The problem is, it really is a slippery slope. And I'm going to show you some secular arguments against it after I get to the religious arguments, but ultimately it leads to euthanasia. People were all up in arms about the Charlie Gard case and stuff in Europe. I hate to tell you, I wasn't surprised. That story didn't surprise me. Did you know the Children's Hospital in Toronto, Canada, is threatening to euthanize children against their parents' wishes? That's what happens when you go down this path, by the way. When you don't understand who the human person is, you get yourself into trouble. Iceland brags about the fact that they are getting rid of Down syndrome because we make you take prenatal testing, and if you have Down syndrome, we abort your child. Highly, highly scary. There are both religious and secular arguments against it. Romans 14. If we live, we live to the Lord. If we die, we die to the Lord. Our lives are not our own. We are not the Lord of our life. We don't get to choose when it ends. It's also a question about fundamental rights, religious freedom, and denying universal rights. Human life is the basis of all other rights. I think we get this. If you don't have a right to life, you can't have a right to bear arms, you can't have a right to property, you can't have a right to anything else, because you don't live. So as we attack this, the right to life, we end up attacking the rights to everything else in our country and the foundation on which our country is formed. No one can make the life on an innocent person without opposing God's plan of love. What does it mean to love someone? It means to will what is best for them. Taking one's life is never best for them. It's got some serious problems. It's ultimately a refusal of self-love. It's a refusal of a natural instinct to live. And it's a flight from the duties of justice and charity. A little while ago, it was a setup, of course, as with everything, well, not everything, but with a lot of secular media. One of our local news channels decided to do something on euthanasia. I sat down with the anchor for about an hour interview, and I knew she was going to cut my stuff. She kept hammering me about whether, and I was, of course, opposed to physician-assisted suicide. And she kept hammering me about compassion, compassion, compassion. She kept asking me, don't you care about the person? Think about the case where they're suffering and they want to do this to themselves. And I finally said, stop. It's precisely because I care that I take this position. I said, I don't know about you, but I see these people every week who struggle with this. Should I take my life or not? The struggle's real. And then you begin to ask them questions like, why do you think this is a good thing for you to do? Well, I'm a burden on my family. Number one answer. Not a burden. My life doesn't have value anymore. That's a lie. Even if you can't do anything, you still add value to culture and society. Why? Because someone has to perform acts of charity towards you. You make someone else more charitable, more loving by their actions towards you. We become what we do repeatedly. And so when charity demands that I take care of a loved one, even when it's difficult, even when it's hard, it makes me more loving. Not just to that individual, but to people across the board. And it's a very, very important thing. Ultimately, physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia attempts to make a somebody a nobody. You heard that phrase before? It comes from Martin Luther King Jr. and his talks on racism, and he's right. I believe actually Martin Luther King Jr. was a bioethicist before bioethics. You read some of his work, and it's great. You can take it and apply it from the situation he was facing into a lot of modern day stuff in ethics today. He's right. That's what slavery did. It took a somebody with intrinsic worth and made them a nobody. When I allow you to kill yourself, or I kill you, what do? I take you and make you a nobody, or participate in that. And this is not unheard of. We place restrictions on people all the time. I see it all the time in my work as a police chaplain. The number of calls that go out for people who are threatening their own life. We don't knock at the door and say, are you sure you really want to do this? Okay, go ahead and do it. No, we stop you from doing it, even if it means we have to use force to stop you from doing it. We place restrictions for the good of the individual and for the good of society all the time. The reality is, just be honest, we have a desire to save our lives. It's natural. The fight or flight mechanism. When you begin to feel threatened, what happens? Your heart rate elevates in your body, right? You make a decision about whether I should stay here and fight for my life or I need to run away. Why? Because you want to preserve your life. That's simply the natural instinct. It also, allowing physician-assisted physician-assisted suicide changes radically the notion of medicine and the patient-clinician relationship. Have you ever thought about how vulnerable you are as a patient? This is why, going back to the days of Hippocrates, we had oaths. The physician really does have all the power. He's got the knowledge. He's got the tools. Scalpel's a great thing, but it can also be a deadly weapon. Think about all the faith you place in your physicians, your nurses, and rightfully so. Now, if a physician has the power to kill you, doesn't that erode the trust? The Dutch definitely think it do. Did you know now, if you go into the Netherlands and you look at them, a lot of people who are going into the hospitals in Netherlands are making the hospital sign a contract that their doctors won't kill them. How backwards is that? That, of course, is one of the first countries that legalized physician-assisted suicide. The confidence is eroded. Imagine, so we've got a major doctor shortage already in this country. Imagine the shortage we're going to have if we tell a doctor, Your job now is not only to treat patients, you also have the obligation to kill them if they want to be killed. It's kind of a conflict of interest within the community, and it really does radically change that relationship. It's also a very deadly, deadly move with our push towards profit-driven healthcare systems. One, it fosters discrimination. If physician-assisted suicide is legal, the next step is insurance companies are going to say, I'll pay for the physician-assisted suicide, but I won't pay for your chemotherapy. Which means only the very wealthy will be able to have their cancer treated. Insurance companies do this all the time with treatments. Y'all know what it's like to be denied. Put physician-assisted suicide, that's cheap. Those cocktails are cheap compared to months or years of treatment. That's the next logical move in a profit-driven system. But it also puts vulnerable patients at risk. You know, 1 in 10 elders are already abused in this country. 10%. Now, put yourself in the position of, say you're the only child and mom's got a lot of money right now, but you're watching that savings dwindle as you pay for health care at the end of her life. That inheritance you thought you were getting is beginning to disappear. Might there then be a sort of push to get mom out of here? Hopefully not if we're good Christians. But you see the risk that puts someone at? It also changes the relationship between the caregiver, whether that's a professional caregiver or a family caregiver, and the family member. When physician-assisted suicide is on the table and mom wants it, shouldn't I just give mom what she wants? Instead of stopping and asking the deeper questions? Why do you want it? No, Mom, you're not a burden on me. It radically changes the game. And it's very, very scary when it does. Of course, it's all hidden under the notion of compassion. You remember the Emily Menard case? She was praised as this hero. Again, I can't judge an individual. I'm not pretending to do that with her case at all. Compassion, from the Latin word compassiones, to suffer with. Imagine the society we would begin to breed if we said, you don't have to suffer anymore, we'll just kill you. You don't need to be there to take care of your mom. We can take care of that. Friends, it's a major game changer, and it's coming. It's being legalized in states across the country. As I said, 4 years in a row, it's been introduced in the Missouri State Legislature. When it gets legalized in the country, don't act surprised and say you weren't warned. It's coming, and it's coming quick. As a matter of fact, the American Medical Association, just this summer, against their own ethics board's suggestion, has said we should review whether we're going to take a stance on this. They want to take a neutral stance. We're not for or against physician-assisted suicide. Ooh, it's coming fast. If that's not depressing, let's talk about death. Why not? We've opened the floodgates. We're all going to die. Death is getting complicated. How do we know that you've died? I mean, it used to be you just sort of passed away. If I got a machine breathing for you, does that mean you've died yet? Let's take a look at it. In order to define it, in order to actually treat it, we have to first understand what our obligation is towards those who are dying. One, every person who's in danger of death has an obligation or has a right to know the information that is necessary to their condition. This is just humanity. Your physician needs to be honest with you. They need to let you know what your condition is. You need to have the opportunity to discuss your condition with family members and care providers. You have a right to discuss this with your physician. I don't care how quickly your attending physician wants to walk out of your room. You can make them sit there and explain it and explain it and explain it until you understand it. And if they don't, lodge an ethics complaint. You have a right in every hospital. Every hospital has an ethics team. Some are better than others. But you have a right to speak to them. You have a right to seek counsel from your priest. Now, sometimes time's of the issue, yeah. I mean, sometimes we've got to make decisions. But you also have that right to discuss it. You also have the spiritual support and the opportunity to receive the sacraments. We'll talk a little bit more about hospice care, but I had to slide it in somewhere. Hospice care is a radical shift from the treatment. So we were talking about ordinary, extraordinary means. If we determine that something is now extraordinary and not morally permissible, then there's going to be a shift in care. We're no longer going to seek to cure the illness. We're going to seek to provide comfort and relief and prepare for death. And that is one of the beautiful things about hospice care. It focuses on the patient rather than the disease. It focuses on control of symptoms like reducing pain. The care of both physical, psychological, and spiritual offerings and the needs of a patient's family. This can be normal rate for hospice is 6 months. So just because you go on a hospice doesn't mean you're dying tomorrow. It opens the floodgates of tons of support for family as they're passing away. I get this a lot. A lot of people say, Father, I can't go on hospice. I'm not dying. Like, no, you're not going to die tomorrow. That's not what we're saying. I just had a consult recently. My family won't necessarily go on hospice. My loved one won't go on hospice because we want them to live through Christmas. I'm like, well, your doctor's saying you're probably going to live through Christmas. Don't let hospice kill you. They're not going to. As long as, just because you're going on hospice doesn't mean you're dying tomorrow. I think it's important. The other kicker too, and it's a new field of medicine, is called palliative care. Palliative care is when you have a very serious life-threatening illness. You may or may not survive. So hospice would be a subcategory of palliative care. But palliative care could mean that you're still fighting your cancer. It's going to open up things like pain management. It's going to open up things like spiritual care. We're addressing the seriousness of this. It's my favorite tool as a clinical ethicist. Well, that and a psychiatric evaluation. I'll tell you why later on that one. But just because someone's suggesting palliative care doesn't mean you're going to die either. They're offering you resources that expand beyond just your physician, because you see medicine's getting so specialized. So you're seeing your oncologist who is trained to fight your cancer. But why not bring in a pain doctor to help control the pain? Why not bring in a social worker to help see what kind of support might be out there for you and your family? Why not bring in chaplaincy to help you and your family spiritually prepare for death? See where I'm going with this? So don't be afraid if that kind of conversation comes up. What then is death? This is frustrating. Because when you ask me what death is, I will quote the catechism, and I will tell you that it is a separation of the soul from the body. To which you say, good. What does that mean? Fair point. Well, then I'll quote a little bit further from John Paul II. It is a single event consisting in the total disintegration of that unitary and integrated whole that is the personal self. And you say, Father, please go back to just the separation of the body from the soul. Right? Well, the problem is the death of a person is an event that no scientific technique can define. I can't watch your soul separate from your body. However, we can look at human bodies and say there are certain characteristics of a body that is alive and certain characteristics of a body that is dead. And if we can define those characteristics of a dead body and a physician can notice those things, we can then declare that you have died. You see the distinction? So when you get a time of death, it's not that's the exact moment your soul left your body. That's the exact moment that the physician responsible for your care has observed for at least 5 minutes that all of the symptoms are present of a deceased person. Make sense? It's a technicality, but it's important as we get into this. This also leads then to questions of do not resuscitate orders. First off, people say, should I go DNR, should I not go DNR? It's not that simple. There's different levels of DNR. Some people go no CPR. Some people go no drugs. There's different levels. And actually, there's debate amongst hospital systems even right now of what our code statuses should be. Do not resuscitate orders is actually an application of ordinary and extraordinary means. So, the 92-year-old who has terminal cancer, okay, it probably doesn't make sense to do CPR on her if her heart goes out. I'm relatively healthy. If I'm playing basketball and I collapse, the numbers actually suggest that I have a better chance of survival. It would seem to be ordinary at least to try for a while to revive me. wouldn't make sense for me to go DNR. Does it make sense? It's really just an application of ordinary, extraordinary care, proportionate, disproportionate care. Where the importance about defining death comes in has to do with organ and tissue donation. There are two standards for defining death in the United States right now: total brain death and cardiopulmonary death. They're kind of tied to exactly what they say. Cardiopulmonary death is your heart and your lungs stop. Total brain death is there's total cessation of brain activity, including the brain stem. The brain stem controls the most basic reflexes in your body, controls your body temperature and things like that. So if that total brain is dead, then obviously the body has passed away. There's nothing integrating that entire body anymore. Same with if my heart and my lungs stop and that's irreversible, well then the brain will die very shortly afterwards. And we'll talk about that. I just do want to warn you, there's a push out there for what they're calling higher brain death, so your higher brain controls things like memory, motor function, and that kind of stuff. So basically they want more organs. So what they're trying to do is define death earlier. You still have brainstem activity, you're still regulating your body, you just lost function, normal function as a human being. That has pretty well begun to die out, actually, fortunately. People are kind of beginning to recognize the problems with that. But these two standards of brain and cardiopulmonary, and there's different standards, there's even different debates. For example, in the brain death, how far apart do we have to test? BJC system, test once. Mercy system, test twice, with a certain period in between. These are fascinating debates in ethics today of which is appropriate. So, organ and tissue donation is a good thing. It's an act of charity, as John Paul II reminds us. And it's a great form of an act of charity. Why? Because I'm not giving something that belongs to me, I'm actually giving a part of me. When I offer you my kidney, it's not a possession of mine that I'm parting with, I'm actually offering you part of me. It's a great act of charity. And it's essential. About every 10 minutes, someone is added to the organ donor list needing a donation. About 20 people a day die on that list because they couldn't get an organ. So, if we're going to donate, we don't have to make this very complicated. We want to ensure that if it's a vital organ that you need to live, that you have in fact died. I can't justify your death by saying I'm giving it to someone else. But this is why things like the importance of whole brain death, pardon me, are important. So for example, organs need blood, oxygenated blood, to stay alive. So the question becomes, if I'm pumping oxygenated blood through your body, are you still alive? John Paul II is very clear on this, that if there is no brain activity, there's no integrated whole of your human person. Thus you've passed, and some machine is just sort of systematically keeping those organs alive. Now, in that case, assuming you've died, you can make a donation. This, of course, is exactly what it is, though. It's an act of charity, right? So we cannot force organ donation. Either you choose it, or your power of attorney can choose it on your behalf. Now, people ask me, well, Father, you say organ donation is very good. Have you signed the back of your license? I have not. I am an organ donor. You can take whatever you want from me. It's on tape now. When I'm dead, if it's going to help someone, you can have it. Call me cynical. But a lot of physicians today are utilitarians. Greatest good for the greatest number. They're very pragmatists. So God forbid I get into a terrible car accident and I get brought into the trauma center. Of course, they want to find out who I am so they can contact my next of kin, so they pull my license out. And they just so happen to see that little pretty sticker that says I'm an organ donor. Might there be a temptation for the kind of treatment I'm going to get? I hope not, but there might. Whereas I don't have that little symbol on my donor card, but my next of kin knows I want to be an organ donor. So when they call my next of kin to let them know my scenario, my next of kin is going to come to the hospital. And once it's determined that I am in fact dead or going to be dying, they can have that conversation about organ donation. Another sticky area. Missouri is still an opt-in state. You have to opt in when you go to the DMV. A lot of states are going to opt out now because we need more organs, right? People are dying. 20 people are dying a day. So how do we get more organs? We just assume you want to be an organ donor unless you tell me you don't. Missouri's not that way right now. I don't know if they'll go that way. But there is that opt-in, opt-out version as well. Do what you feel right with. There's certainly nothing morally wrong with signing the organ donor card. Again, being an organ donor is a great act of charity. It's a final act of charity, according to John Paul II. But be prudent about how you do it. Please be aware that your organs can be rejected, though. Now, the other thing we have to say about the organ donation, too, is to help protect this, they are separated out. I'm not going to get into the whole process of how this works, but there is a coordinating agency in the United States called UNOS, which helps track these. And the physician who declares you dead is not the one who's approving the organ transplantation. So there is supposed to be a dividing wall there to help protect against this. So I don't mean to scare you in that way. However, I have been in many a room where there is a pressure to family members to donate. It's not supposed to happen that way, but I've seen it. And these are given justly, and UNOS has a very good system based off of the matching type of the organ with potential donor, looking at things like the seriousness of the donor. So someone who needs a kidney in the next week to live is probably going to be ahead of the list than someone who can wait 5 years. Distance, how long can that organ survive, and things like that. So the process itself, at least on paper, is very just. But we want to be careful that we don't discriminate, right? It's a gift. So we shouldn't be discriminating against it, and it is. There's a major black market out there for organs right now. Major. China, India, place like that. And Americans are flying there to get organs. They're so desperate. Of course, that would be gravely immoral. The last thing I'll say about organ donation is there can also be living organ donation. So there are non-vital organs. For example, you have 2 kidneys. Most people do. You don't need both of them. And so let's say there's a family member, someone close to you who needs an organ to survive, perhaps a kidney. There would be nothing immoral if you matched to generously give of your kidney to that loved one. Provided, of course, you're a good candidate for the surgery, medically you're indicated to make a full recovery and things like this. Lungs are another thing. So there are some that are non-vital organs. Obviously, you can't give your heart while you're still alive. But non-vital organs could be transplanted that way. And when it's done that way, it can be done by choice. You can choose to donate to an individual person. High-profile case in St. Louis would be Ann Allred from Channel 5, whose story was all over the news with that. Perfectly morally acceptable.
Is it ethical to negotiate something of value for connection with organ donation?
So the question is, can I sort of barter for something of value for an organ donation? No, that would be highly illegal. Why? And immoral? Why? It's no longer a gift if I'm bartering for it. Whether you pay cash or whether you pay your great masterpiece or your wedding ring.
In other words, I guess what I'm saying is that I have family needs that need extensive medical assistance.
Yeah.
And I realize that I have an organ that I can donate and still survive and all that kind of stuff. Do you guarantee or assure that you receive all necessary health care benefits if I donate an organ?
Sure, so that's the way it normally works, is that your medical bills associated with donating that organ would be covered, yes.
No, for any other thing.
No.
All your health care for the rest of your life.
No, now you're bartering for a service. Now you're bartering, you're saying, look, I'll give you my kidney, but you need to take care of any future medical bills that pop up.
Well, that's what I was...
Yeah.
Asking the question, is that wrong?
It's never wrong to ask a question. It would be wrong to make an agreement where I'm going to give you an organ in exchange for something of value. Then it's not a gift.
I'll give you an eye for a kidney.
Yeah, that's not a gift, right? Now we're bartering. It has to be a free gift. Why does it have to be a free gift? It's not mine to begin with. Right? I don't own my heart. I don't own my kidney or my liver. No, but it doesn't belong to me in that sense, right? It's a gift to me from God. Am I responsible in any way for me having a liver? No. Even if you're not Christian, even if you're a complete atheist, it belongs to my parents then, right? I don't contribute anything to the development of my liver, right? It was there.
You donate a liver, an organ, and it's considered a virtuous thing to do.
Mm-hmm. What makes it virtuous is the gift. The donation of a part of ourself to another.
But it belongs to you.
No, it's a part of me. There's a big difference between belonging to me and a part of me. This clicker belongs to me. Well, actually, it probably belongs to one of the institutions I worked for. But you get the point. It was bought. Yeah.
It belongs to me and it's a part of me.
Yeah, it belongs to you, but it's not a part of you in the way your heart is a part of you. You've inserted it into yourself.
Biological adaptations to the human organism is a thing of the future.
We'll talk about that at the end. We'll get back to that. We'll talk about that at the end. Just because it might be coming to doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing. So, you've passed away. Another form of donation would be to donate your body to science. The development of science with cadavers, etc. Now, they are creating what they call syndavers, or these synthetic cadavers. And they're used in a lot of medical schools and a lot of like PT schools and things like this. But the studies are showing they're not as effective in the teaching. That, of course, is good. It's a contribution to society, but we want to make sure that your body is respected. So if you're going to donate, you need to know what's going to happen to your body. I showed up at a conference recently, and I looked around the room to where the surgeons were going next, and there were torsos on a table. I don't know where the rest of the body was. What are they using it for? Will they respect my body? Will my body be given a proper burial at the end? So the most common way that this is done is you donate to a medical school. But you still need to ask further questions like, what will the medical school do with my body when I'm finished? We have two very good medical schools in St. Louis, Washington University and St. Louis University. St. Louis University has a general plot in one of our Catholic cemeteries. They cremate you and they bury you in that general plot with a prayer service. Washington University cremates you and scatters your ashes across the campus. Right? So you got to ask the question. What's going to happen to my body? Please also be aware, because I get some needs for assistance on this, just because you want to donate your body to science doesn't mean they're necessarily going to take it. If you die of some sort of infectious disease, obviously we're not going to take your body. You die of some sort of trauma, severe obesity, they've got a whole list of criteria. So people will do this too sometimes to save some money. There's still costs associated with it. You've got to pay a transport fee. But be aware that it could be rejected. The last thing is, if you're going to donate your body to science, you must have signed while you were living. Your family cannot make that choice on your behalf. So the key there is just to ensure that you're there. The last thing to recognize, and for me it's not a big deal, but it is for some people, donating organs or your body may change your funeral plan. So for example, the donation of skin. A good thing for burn victims, right? You may not be able to have an open casket. Doesn't bother me at all. But in some cultures and some societies, that's a big deal. So you want to make sure that that's done. That leads into my last topic before I get to questions, and that has to do with advanced directives. Most people do not have an advanced directive. Most people get into trouble because they don't have an advanced directive. We're going to die. Most of us are going to get hospitalized in the process of our death. Very few of us are just not going to wake up one morning. Right? What are your wishes? There's three common ways that this is done. One is through a durable power of attorney for medicine, medical power of attorney. One is through a living will, and one is through a POLST, or in some states called a MOLST, which is a physician or a medical order of life-sustaining treatment. These are all three legal documents that sort of articulate what kind of care you want. It's important to recognize they don't go into effect until you can no longer make your own healthcare choices. So you can have one of these documents on file, but it's not going into effect until you've been deemed that you can't make your own decisions anymore. My suggestion to you is to use a medical power of attorney to run as far away from living wills and POLSTs as you can. Durable power of attorney, you give the rights to someone else to make medical choices for you. Now, you of course need to have discussions with them about your wishes. I'm a medical power of attorney, I think, for like 5 or 6 priests in the diocese. I don't know why. Like, one of the guys, I don't know that I'd ever met before. And he's calling me, I'm like, all right, my deal with it is I'll do it for you, but you and I need to sit down before I sign that paper. I need to know your wishes. The other thing you need to know is I'm not going to violate my faith for you. If I love you, I want what's best for you. So you cannot ask me to do things like physician-assisted suicide and authorize that. You can't ask me to authorize the removal of nutrition and hydration if it's not morally appropriate. But by giving someone that power, you're actually making the best choice for yourself. You see, a living will is a document you create where you say, if this happens to me, here's how I want to be treated. It's a false sense of security. It's a false sense that I can still maintain control. In order to make a free and conscious choice, I have to know the outcome, the potential outcomes. I have to know the risks. I have to know the probabilities of success, right? I simply can't know that. Let me give you a practical example. If I sat down to create a living will, I'm going to think about when I'm 85 years old and in the nursing home, right? Therefore, I want to go DNR. I happen to play basketball with my friends tomorrow, pass out, and now there's this living will that says I want to be DNR. I don't actually want to be DNR. But the form says I do. My grandfather's a lawyer. I work with lawyers. I have high respect for lawyers. But when lawyers get involved, things get messy. That document's going to be binding. Unless you've got a magician of a lawyer who can somehow weasel you out of it. But remember, we're talking CPR, so we don't have months to litigate this in court. See what happened there, though? I wasn't thinking about that possibility. Now, that's a big example, of course, but even small examples might change over time. So perhaps a living will would be acceptable for someone who has end-stage cancer and can really predict the future, because they pretty much know where the future's going. But in ordinary circumstances, that's not going to help. A MOLST or a POLST do pretty much the same thing. Basically, what they do is they ask you a series of questions, and you check the boxes. Same problem as a living will. Now, I am grateful that hospitals today, when you enter the hospital, that one of the first questions they ask you is, do you have a durable power of attorney? Do you have some sort of medical directives? And if you tell them no, they're going to walk, usually a chaplain is the one who gets stuck doing it. They're going to walk a chaplain into your room, and they're going to try and get you to fill one out. I'm actually kind of grateful for that. At least we got some attempt. Now, they cannot force you to do this. So don't be filling things out if you haven't thought about it, right? And just because they give you a form doesn't mean you have to use that form. Just because it's a Catholic hospital doesn't mean that their form is really good. Their forms are not approved outside of their system. Most Catholic hospitals have a box about whether you want nutrition and hydration. So, you have a right to use your own. Mine is actually very simple. I give my durable power to a particular person. This person I love dearly. This person has some medical knowledge, is a good person, wants to do it right, but she is Catholic stupid. And I know this because this person continually calls me about like basic things first graders know. For Christmas, I'm going to buy her a first grade religion textbook. Now, this person is a saint of a woman. But in the complex stuff, she's going to be very, very lost. So I put a little caveat on it. Says she's got to talk to a priest before she ends life-sustaining treatment. That's how mine reads. The Archdiocese of St. Louis has a very good one that was produced as well. There are some good ones out there. But just think through how you want to do it. The other thing, too, is choose your durable power wisely. Maybe the person who's the medical guru isn't the best choice. I love my dad, but he's a surgeon. He is trained to one thing, keep you alive. Right? That's what he does. He knows more about medicine than anyone in my family. And he loves me and wants what's best for me. But I think there's going to be some blinders that perhaps come on. Maybe he's not the best choice for durable power. A niece or nephew who can't read yet is also not a good. Or, in the other direction, your parents who now have Alzheimer's. You may need to revise your durable power of attorney because maybe they're not in a place now where they should be making those choices for you. Make sense? I've gone a little bit over an hour. I got about a half hour for questions, which scares me, but I'll take them. Questions? Yes?
I am confused about your organ donation.
Okay.
Okay, so you can't take an organ out of someone until they're dead.
You cannot take a vital organ, so an organ that would be necessary to keep them alive.
You cannot take a vital organ out of someone unless they're dead. And if Mercy Hospital does 2 tests for death, 5 minutes apart, your organ that is dead
So it's not a test of heart-lung function at that point. It's a brain death test. Yeah, so they're going to be on some form of life support to make sure that the body is still oxygenated. John Paul II, when faced... Now, there are Catholic moral theologians, there are Catholic ethicists who will say that things like heart transplant should never be permissible. Because they will say, as long as your heart is still beating, there is integration. John Paul II, not teaching definitively on this matter, but still worth serious consideration, has said that if there is no brain function, your integrated whole as a human body has ceased to exist. Your body doesn't control itself in any way. It's totally computerized, if you will, to use very simplistic terms. Therefore, in essence, the way John Paul II would read that in very simplistic terms is, you have died and we found a machine just to continue the functions of the body. Does that make sense? In which case, if you've already died, removing that machine, which is continuing the functions of the body, would not be killing you. And thus, he would say that heart transplantation would be morally permissible. It is debated. And we had a lot of conversation on this in my first talk about beginning of life. And this is the importance of understanding the true purpose of conscience. Conscience is not, I do whatever I want. But conscience is our best moral judgment. And so we have to take all the facts that are presented to you. And in a case where there's no definitive church teaching here to guide us, good men could quibble about this. And if I were your ethicist at an end-of-life situation, and you were in the position after having considered all the facts that you should not donate a heart, you're not going to get any pressure from me to override that conscience. I will lay out John Paul II's argument for you. I will even be happy to lay out the argument of those who oppose heart transplant for you. And then it would be your job and your conscience to try and form that after being totally informed. Personally, and I've wavered on this issue back and forth in my studies, I think John Paul II has a very good point here. And again, I'm very, very simplifying this, and all analogies fail, and I recognize that. But if the brainstem has passed, there's no activity there. Sure, and Mercy does not wait 5 minutes, they wait longer than that. I'm not going to give away their policies. But, right, and there are certain criteria. The number one criteria is called the Harvard criteria, which has set standards for what kind of tests we do, including pain stimulus response, looking at pupil dilation, actually taking scans of the brain. Other things too, we have to make sure that you're not on certain narcotics, that you're free of any sort of psychodepressant, that your body temperature is at normal temperature. So we've eliminated all these things that might give us a false read. And only once that criteria is in place can we then begin the testing process. So yes, we can definitively tell, and I would feel very confident under the criteria being used, especially in a double test. I'm a bigger fan of a double test, I'll be honest with you. But in a double test, I would feel morally, at a level of moral certitude, that there is no brainstem activity. If that's the case, going back to my really cheap analogy, it would be almost as though everything is shut down. I'm trying to think of a good play, sort of a good physical analogy that you might see this in. So everything is totally shut down, and I've just brought a machine in to do the activity now. My body is not integrated. My body is not controlling in any way any function. I just found a machine to do that for me. Now, of course, cardiopulmonary fails on that because we stop hearts all the time and bring them back with open heart surgeries and things like that. But there's still an integrated whole of the body, and that has to do with the brain is still regulating things. See what I'm saying? So that doesn't work in reverse. Just because your cardiopulmonary stopped, we may make a decision not to revive you based off of a proper use of ordinary extraordinary means. Or we may fail to revive you, right? In which case the brainstem is going to die and you will pass. In which case, something like that, the cardiopulmonary standard makes sense. We don't need to wait and go through all these tests. But especially someone with severe brain trauma, those who have been in persistent vegetative states and things like that, we're going to be looking, my push from the clinical ethics point is going to be to define whole brain death. Does that help? Okay. So the question is the administration of morphine at the end of life. Now, morphine is very helpful for pain, but it does things like slows respiratory rates and can kill you if you have too much of it. And there are some cases where they're telling people, don't be afraid to use it, don't be afraid to use it. And it could be motivated from a good perspective of we want to make sure the patient's comfortable. But you're right, we want to make sure it's regulated. So any sort of morphine that's going to cause death will be problematic. They have a technical term for this. It's called terminal sedation. The idea behind this is basically we give you so much drug that you're just sort of unconscious. And I get asked about terminal sedation a lot, and the question I tell people to ask their physician is, if I needed to reverse it, could I? If so, I don't believe we've actually killed you. Now, there is nothing wrong with death being hastened as a side effect. If you attended my first presentation, we went through that principle of double effect, which recognizes that sometimes when we are trying to do something that is good, it comes with unintended yet foreseen bad consequences. So I am legitimately trying to treat pain. And there's an unintended bad side effect that it may hasten death. This process may be sped up. There is a proportionately grave reason for acting here. There is good pain. She's going to die anyways. Fine. It couldn't be the cause of that, but it could hasten it. Does that make sense? Now, I'm a big proponent of hospice as well. With that said, it doesn't mean you can't go off hospice either. There are some deadly traps with hospice, right? We're not going to give you certain medication. I consulted very recently on a case, actually it was the mother of a priest who passed away. Mother had been on hospice for a while. Mother contracted a urinary tract infection. That's pretty common in nursing homes. And the hospice said, we're not going to give her antibiotics. Well, you begin to realize one of the side effects of UTIs is you can sort of go mentally a little off. And this priest finally said, look, mom's just not the same. So I said, well, take her to the ER and get this started. To which the physician tried to convince him that mom was going to die anyways. So mom was actually hospitalized for about 3 days before she passed. 24 hours before she passed, her UTI began to clear up a little bit. She became more lucid. And he would tell you he had a very nice conversation, very nice final conversation with his mother. Hospice was actually effective for him and his family up until those last moments. Fine, great. Take her off. Put her back on. It's an important lesson, though. Be vigilant with your loved one's health care. I mean, that's just a good practice in general. And if something doesn't seem right, it's probably not right. You don't have to know why it's wrong to sense it's wrong. And if you think something's wrong, start asking questions. If it's a medical thing, start asking questions of the medical community. If it's an ethics thing, bring your priest in. If he's not giving you the answers he knows, he can call me, but you can call me too. That's what I do. I live in hospitals. There are answers. You don't have to know them. If you sense something's wrong, ask the question. What do you got to lose? Does that help? But you make a fair point. So the short answer for your morphine is there a risk with leaving it on the table? Yeah. I mean, I think you can make a legal risk too about the prescription of medication, right? Those who are even not qualified to be offering medication at the end are doing so. Though you can also control that from a hospice perspective. If you are the care provider, you can say to the hospice provider, no, do not leave that medication there. So in-home hospice, oftentimes they have the medical box at home. If you're the provider, tell them to shut it and lock it. If you think there's a risk that someone might use that in a nefarious way.
Well, I think more specifically, I'm talking about families not even knowing.
Right.
Saying, oh, here you go.
Right, and this is one of the frustrations in the medical community. One, you are already vulnerable because you're under pressure. You know that someone's counting on you. You also have a ton of emotions floating through your head. A lot of people who face these things are actually not in a good position to be making decisions. I'll tell you right now, I will not make an ethics decision for my family member by myself. I've got degrees in it. I will seek outside counsel because I won't be in a position to be thinking through these things logically and clearly. And you might be right. You might be highlighting a very serious issue in some of our hospice homes. I would say, though, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't make an argument that we got to cut all the morphine back, which you're not. I know you're not saying that. But you may be making a fair point about the need to make sure that that is actually being regulated. And I would agree with you. There are real concerns there. Yes?
Handle situations where you're asked to consult and another family member doesn't.
So my first question is, who has the power of attorney, right? Who's legally binding? Now, power of attorney are helpful, but I don't like powers of attorney. I like family consensus. Here's why. Christmas is coming up. You guys are gonna, I'm telling you, I have seen death tear families apart. These are why plans are huge. I've seen it from a physical side, where families don't talk over a quilt that mom promised both the sisters. And I'm like, I bet mom promised both the sisters the quilt. That probably happened. But now you don't talk. And actually now is when they start, well, about a month ago they started rolling into my office from the whole year. Maybe you died in February, but now Thanksgiving and Christmas are here, so everything's, of course, exacerbated. But you also get this with medical treatment. Someone's forced to make a care decision, and now family members think that that person killed mom. Right? Even though they really didn't. They made the best choice they could, but mom's dead, and part of the grieving process now is it's easier just to blame the sister. That's why having these plans are essential. The other thing I'll say is, try me. I can be charming sometimes. Yes?
Case of a person over 80 who's written it, lifelong Catholic, had the last sacrament several times, advanced directive she doesn't want to be resuscitated or have tubes if she's mentally incapacitated, has numerous strokes, is incapacitated, in a nursing home crying every single day because she hates her life, and has no greater desire than to go to Jesus and go to heaven. And has told her family, don't keep me here, I'm ready for God, I want to go.
Sure.
Is that okay to honor her wishes?
Sure. Again, so I'll have to give my stipulation. I'll give you a general answer. I cannot give specific answers to specific cases without looking at medical charts. I just can't. The one thing I hear there that I want to be sure of is I want a psychiatric evaluation. I'm ready to go to Jesus. That could be authentic, but it could also be nefarious. When I did my residency, it became a running joke. If I was going to be the ethicist who got consulted during my residency, don't even put it in the chart till you've already got a psych eval, because I'm not even going to go visit the patient until you put the psych eval in, and I can see what the mental status is. Yeah. Right. Right. Again, I'm going to believe she's got the good intention, but depression is a brutal thing. And so I just want to check it out. What I got to lose? Let's get an eval. And again, I can't judge that particular case that you obviously have a particular case in mind. I can't judge that. I've not seen it. The other thing too is there was certainly no malicious act if that occurred.
I mean, and along with that, aren't we as Christians also supposed to accept that we are going to die? And
Right.
God made that we are going to die, and we don't have to do every single thing possible on this earth to avoid dying, because if we have the sacraments, we're close to God, and we want to go to heaven. Am I morally obliged to do everything I possibly can?
No, you are obliged to use ordinary and proportionate means. And what you described to me on the surface, without seeing every medical fact, seems to imply to me that that CPR could be deemed disproportionate or extraordinary. The only thing I really get worried about is, in order for her to make a choice about ordinary and proportionate, she has to be in a right state of mind. If you're not in a right state of mind, you can't make a free choice. And that's the other reason I would ask for a psych consult, would just to be assured that depression is not setting in, she's not feeling useless, she's not feeling unloved. Not saying that's where she was, right? But I just want to dot my I's and cross my T's. And so I'm going to put in the request for that psych, and if she is making a sound moral judgment, I'm inclined to believe with her there, yeah. Sounds like a good application of extraordinary, disproportionate care. But I just want to be sure from a clinical side that she really has that capacity to make that free consent. Yes?
Two quick comments, or not so much a question, but a comment. One of them has to do with the statement I read on the chart here. It said, intention in causing one's own death is equally as wrong as murder. I'd like to talk to you about that at a later time.
Sure.
And also the other one is, a thought occurred to me, is about sleep apnea. My mother died in a hospital. She was severely affected by a number of things, but sleep apnea was a very big part, and this was at a time when it wasn't understood very well.
Sure.
They gave her a sedative, and she didn't respond to the normal physiological processes. So sleep apnea can be used to shorten a person's life.
Sure. I mean, let's face it. Doctors can use all kinds of means if they want to, if they're evil. Let's go back to basic moral theology 101. Every action has three parts. It has an object, it has an intention, and it has a circumstance. The object is that thing that is directly chosen. The intention is the reason why you're choosing it, and the circumstances are all those other things around it. In order for an action to be deemed evil, if one of those three is evil, the whole action is evil. My classic example, I'm walking down the street with my best friend. I see a poor person on the street, I slide him $50. Seems like a good action. That's a good action of giving money. What I didn't tell you was my intention was to look like a really generous friend, a really generous guy to my friend. I just committed the sin of pride. You got to know the intention, you got to know the circumstances surrounding that case as well, right? Let me comment very briefly on that statement that intentionally taking of a life is the same as murder. What is the definition of murder? The intentionally taking of a human life. Whether I take my own life or somebody else's, it's still murder. Now, there's a difference between permitting death and taking death. Allowing myself to die in a case of extraordinary case, that's not taking my life. That's permitting my life because I've got a justifiable reason for it. So, and we can talk about that afterwards. I'd be happy to get into that conversation. Yes?
About 6 months ago, the church was saying something about cremation that I did not understand at all. I don't like, well, is it too long?
No.
Because I don't like the whole idea anyway, but I still wondered why they even spoke up.
Sure. So this is one of the most odd assignments I've gotten as a priest. The Post-Dispatch ran an article about a new form of cremation called alkaline hydrosis, also called flameless cremation. A new thing that's sort of integrated. It's not really that new. It's been around for 100 years for like animal carcasses and things like this, but it's relatively new for humans. And the diocese got bombarded with questions of, is this a morally permissible way to dispose of my body? So for some reason, when they get a question they can't figure out, it becomes medical ethics. And I get a phone call. It started out in the liturgy office. Then he probably kicked it to the cemetery office. And then somehow it came to the ethics. And I tried to kick it back to cemetery and got stopped. So I got stuck writing a paper on it. The church permits cremation for suitable reason. So the reason the church, for most of her history, has not permitted cremation was the respect for the human body. We don't want people cremating the body saying it's not that important. The church has permitted cremation in the past, like during the bubonic plague, right? We don't want to be burying those bodies. We want to burn that. So the church says as long as there's still a respect for the dignity of the human body, cremation is okay. So that dignity of the human body would mean that we're still interring the body in the ground, in a marked grave, right? Respect. That also has psychological reasons too. It's good for you psychologically to go and visit the dead. Having ashes on your mantle is problematic. Maybe it's okay for you, but let's fast forward 2 generations and your great-great-grandchildren. They're not going, who is this? And why do I have this thing on my mantle? Right? So as long as the respect of the body is there, it is permissible. The question then is this new method of doing it with chemicals permissible? So the normal way is through high heat. Then the question becomes, well, what if we do it with chemicals? Apparently it's more eco-friendly is the marketing ploy behind it. My position with it, and it's a position that the Archbishop and the Missouri bishops have agreed with, is that the idea of basically taking your body and destroying it in acid violates the dignity. Not the major issue there, though, is what do we do with the remnant of that chemical? They currently flush it down the drain. It goes down into the sewer system. So in normal cremation, any sort of material, if it's not turned to ash, is raised back into the atmosphere. I have a problem not with the means of the chemical doing that, it's of disposing that chemical down into the sewer system. My best analogy would be with the Eucharist. Again, and all analogies fail. But it would not be good for me to take the Eucharist, or even if I'm purifying the vessel, the water that touched that, and pour it into the dirty sewer system. The body deserves greater respect. If that company came to me and asked for a recommendation, my recommendation to them would be to find a way to dispose of that chemical remnant properly. So could we bury the chemical remnant with the person? If so, I'm okay with it. This would be sort of in a similar way sometimes with like amniotic fluid and things from women who miscarry. That fluid can be buried with the child. Tragedy, yes. Still morally permissible. So that's why all the hoopla broke up in St. Louis. Yeah, that was my month of June. Now you see why I study bioethics. Right.
Ashes are remains, but the chemicals, even ashes are not really.
Right.
Remains there.
Right, but it's from what was once a human body. The human body is so sacred. So, for example, to take, I'll give you an example. So let's say I visit someone in a nursing home and try to offer them communion, and they put it in their mouth, but they can't swallow it. That's still Jesus. I love you, Jesus, but I'm not swallowing that myself. The church actually instructs that we would take that and dissolve it in water. Why? Because then it ceases to be bread. It's no longer Jesus. However, the church would say we shouldn't pour that down the drain. Why? Because it's connection to the sacred. The human body is sacred. That chemical remnant has broken down the body. I shouldn't take that and just pour it down where my sewage goes. If you want to bury it, fine. That's why I don't have a problem with the process. I have a problem with the disposal of it. Yes?
Between the medical power of attorney and the living will, does one supersede the other?
That's a legal question. I am not an attorney. I would assume that it's whichever one is more recent, but I'm not an attorney. I can't answer that. Did you, so, is it, so you composed both of them, had them both notarized on the same day? Okay. Jeez, that's, we're in the hospital, I call the legal department and say, figure this one out. This is, again, this isn't ethics. You can always remove one. Yeah, you can always X through any of your things. Just go get it, next through it, and notarize it. Say that you've canceled it. You can always change these too. Could do that too. Here's the issue though. Define debate, right? So it sounds good on paper. You're a clinician. You know what it's like in there. It's not always so pretty in the clinical setting. Got about 5 minutes or so. Yes? I like that. That's a medical decision. That's a medical choice. And again, this is the beautiful thing about ethics is I am not a physician. I don't make those decisions. I am there. I know a lot of medicine. I've been trained in that element to basically, I call it the lie detector. But that's going to be a medical decision. Is the body able to assimilate? So for example, am I just popping up like a balloon because I can't do anything with the water? Okay, it's not assimilating. But that is a medical decision. Yes?
Follow up to that, in the event that physician has decided that further hydration and nutrition would be detrimental to the person as they're dying, how long does that dying process take? I felt years ago, my cousins made a decision to cut out everything from my aunt. And I felt sitting at the bedside that I was part of suicide. I felt horrible, and I was not in a position to make a decision. And I felt like days I was watching my aunt die, and I tried to hydrate from the fountain. It's like if I couldn't do what she needed.
Yeah.
What do we look for?
Yeah, again, I'd have to look at this specific case. 8 days to me seems like a long time to not be able to assimilate. I've not come across that in my work right now. I'm not saying it's not possible. I've not come across it. The issue there is cooperation with evil. So the first thing to clarify is if we can't make a choice on that, you're not cooperating in that evil, right? If you don't have a power, decision-making power, you're not choosing an evil. Now, you do have an obligation to some extent to try and educate your family to do those pushes, but I'm sure you probably did. So from that perspective, there's no moral culpability. This is why, too, it's important. There's nothing wrong with asking for a second opinion, too. If you're suspicious of what your medical provider is telling you, ask for a second opinion.
So you're saying, though, in the event that the doctor has said, and the doctor said, well, her body's in a state of active dying.
8 days on, now, I'm only current. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of been my experience in that active dying phase. I'm not a physician. I've never seen an 8-day active dying phase. You see certain criteria. Again, I'm not a physician, but like, for example, the raspy breathing and things like this are signs of the active dying phase. I've not experienced that 8 days out. I'm not saying it can't happen. but I've not experienced that. At 8 days, if you asked me to consult on that, I would seek another physician's opinion to verify. Yeah.
With the nutrition and water, of course, you can debate TPN, G2,
Sure.
all that stuff. But I think it's important, exactly to point out what you're saying, that when you're dying, the Catholic Church or ethics in general never says, oh, we have a week to live,
Right.
4 days to live. When you're actively dying, no one's saying everybody should have feeding
Right.
across the board. But when it's months or,
Yeah.
when the dying is purely from food and water, that's a different story. But I think to your point about like you fight forever, there is a time when you're dying because of the cancer or whatever it is, and then you don't eat and drink, and there are lots of signs that lead up to
Yeah.
that point, and then all that other stuff is irrelevant.
Yeah, again, remember the Catholic way is the middle way. You can swing too far to the other side of treatment. That was a master's thesis of mine of when am I actually torturing you, right? Just putting every tube, every IV into your body, shocking your system. At what point? Now, remember our criteria for ordinary extraordinary means. It's in the judgment of the patient. In the case of a patient can't make their own decision in their power of attorney, but that's not a license to do whatever you want either. It becomes a fascinating legal question of what do we do when we get to those debates? And I believe that there are certain avenues. I believe, for example, so a lot of the legal standard has to do with the standard of care, which is very local. What would any other physician in your position do? So, for example, if it gets to a point where a patient or their family is expressing that care that they want, that all the medical carriers are saying that's not good, well, then I would say they have an obligation to try and turf you to someone else who will provide the care. And if nobody will provide the care, then to me that would be a standard that this is unethical. It's not a perfect system, but there's certainly some of that goes on as well. And you do get to some of these cases where families are not able to let go. Perhaps families have an obligation. The case study I took, actually I won't talk much more about it because I need to protect confidentiality on it. But there was some issue with family members not ready to let go. And I won't say more than that. But some of that too is you got to work with the family members. You got to have those. You got to be willing to sit down and have those conversations. You got to breathe some truth into the situation. And so I will always tell people I'd rather you be more cautious than less cautious, but you can be too cautious. So never dig your heels into a point that you won't move. Dig your heels into a point where you're pursuing truth, and until someone shows you truth in the other way, you're willing to stand your ground. Make sense? Yes? Right, so a PVS, first off, I hate that terminology. And I'm just going to say, you're not a vegetable. But you're still somebody, you're still alive. Are you contributing to society? I'd argue you are. Charity. So just because you can't function doesn't mean you cease to be a person. It's an important distinction about where we get our dignity as human people, intrinsic or extrinsic. Do I have value of a person because of something that is conferred upon me or because of who I am? Of course it's because of who I am. And the second you want to say it's extrinsic, I'm going to warn you of Hitler. I'm going to warn you of slavery in America, right? Who is man to make another man? We can't. One has value because you are a person. Not because of the things you can do as a person, but because of who you are. Nobody can take that from you, just as no one can give it to you. Therefore, just because you can't do anything anymore, which I don't actually believe, I still believe you're a contributing member, doesn't mean you cease to have dignity and deserve to be respected, which means your best interest should be sought for, which means I shouldn't kill you.